Ieyasu Tokugawa, the realm's new master in all but name, gathering its real power into his own hands, had advanced as far as Oyama in Shimotsuke, north of Edo, when the urgent reports came riding in from Osaka one after another. The three commissioners had turned. Teramoto Mori had entered Osaka Castle. Fushimi was under siege. Ieyasu Tokugawa halted the march on Aizu, then he turned his army west. With Masanori Fukushima at their head, the lords in his train who owed their houses to Hideyoshi chose to stand not with the Western army that claimed the Toyotomi name, but with Ieyasu Tokugawa. Leaving his second son, Hideyasu Yuki, and the lords at Utsunomiya to watch Aizu, Ieyasu Tokugawa himself rode back to Edo Castle. From here, his weapon was not the sword, it was the pen. Settled in Edo, over roughly 2 months, he scattered well over 100 letters across the country, promises of land, appeals to old friendship, invitations to betray, threats, and guarantees. The outcome of the war was being decided by a web of letters. Meanwhile, the vanguard, 30-odd thousand men under Masanori Fukushima and Terumasa Ikeda, doubled back west along the Tokaido, and by mid-September had assembled at Kiyosu Castle in Owari. The Western Army, too, pushed into Mino. Mitsunari Ishida left Sawayama and entered Ogaki Castle. Yoshihiro Shimazu joined him there. And the Lord of Gifu Castle declared for the West, Hidenobu Oda, grandson and heir of the great Nobunaga Oda himself. The front line in Mino seemed set. But this war did not belong to Mino alone. In the north, in October, the Wasugi did not chase Ieyasu Tokugawa's retreating back. They poured instead into the Mogami lands of Dewa, 20-odd thousand men under Kanetsugu Naoe. The border fort of Hataya spurned the demand to surrender. Its commander, Mitsukio Eguchi, and his few hundred died to the last man. The Wasugi host then closed around Hasedo Castle, the throat of the road to Yamagata, its defender, Mitsuyasu Shimura, with roughly 1,000. Yoshiaki Mogami stood behind them with 7,000 from Yamagata Castle, and his nephew Masamune Date sent 3,000 under his own uncle, Masakage Rusu. They would call it the Sekigahara of the North. For half a month, 1,000 men in one castle turned back the assaults of 20-odd thousand. Among the attackers fell Yasutsuna Kamizumi, kin of Nobutsuna Kamizumi, the sword saint himself. In the very days when the decisive battle was being joined in Mino, the north too was burning. When word of the defeat arrived, Kanetsugu Naoe raised the siege and fell back to Yonezawa, beating off the pursuing Mogami in one fierce rearguard action after another. The great Wasugi army never turned toward the Kanto at all. In Hokuriku, Toshinaga Maeda marched south from Kanazawa with 25,000. He took Daishoji Castle, and its commander Munanaga Yamaguchi died there with his son. But two things stopped the Maeda advance: a rumor that Yoshitsugu Otani's army was coming by sea to strike his rear, and the presence of Nagashige Niwa, the lord of Komatsu, who stood with the west. On the retreat to Kanazawa, on the narrow causeway of Asai Nawate, Niwa's men fell upon the rearguard, and the Maeda lost no small number of men. By the time they turned south again, the decisive battle was already out of reach. In Shinshu, Hidetada Tokugawa's 38,000, moving up the Nakasendo, were caught fast by Masayuki Sanada at Ueda Castle. The Sanada had split themselves east and west, the father Masayuki and his second son Nobushige for the west, the eldest son Nobuyuki, bound to the Tokugawa by marriage, for the east. And now the Tokugawa main force besieged the castle of the father and the brother. The garrison was barely 3,000, but with taunts and ambushes they mauled the attackers, and Hidetada Tokugawa gave up the siege and hurried west. The broken roads of the Kiso Valley and the driving rain did the rest. The Tokugawa main force, 38,000 strong, reached Omi 5 days after the battle. In the home provinces, Takatsugu Kyogoku shut himself in Otsu Castle with 3,000 and raised the flag against the west. His wife, Hatsu, was a sister of Yodo, the mother of Hideyori Toyotomi. One sister stood beside the symbol of the west, one sat in an eastern castle, and the third, Go, lived in Edo as the wife of Hidetada Tokugawa. This war was tearing even the women of a single house in three. Motoyasu Mori and Munashige Tachibana surrounded Otsu with 15,000, and cannon on the heights battered the keep. The castle held until the morning of the decisive day, and on the day it opened its gates, those 15,000 were not at Sekigahara. At Tanabe, in Tango, the old general Yusai Hosokawa, sole living bearer of the Koken Denju, the secret poetic tradition of the court, held out with 500 against 15,000. Many of the attackers were his own students in poetry, and the assault was listless. Fearing the tradition would die with him, the court at last sent down an imperial envoy. 2 days before the decisive battle, the castle was opened by order of the emperor. In Kyushu, Josui Kuroda, supposedly retired, used his hoarded gold and silver to gather 9,000 ronin and began a land grab while the house burned. In the same week as the decisive battle, he broke Yoshimune Otomo, the former lord of Bungo, at Ishigakibaru, and went on carving Kyushu from the north. In Higo, Kiyomasa Kato turned his troops on the domain of Yukinaga Konishi. On paper, the Western Army was a giant, but its strength was being eaten away, little by battle lines scattered the length of Japan. The main front of the war was tightening around Mino, the province where the great highways between Kyoto and Edo meet. By late September, the vanguard at Kiyosu had grown restless. Ieyasu Tokugawa still would not stir from Edo, and the messenger who at last arrived from Edo turned the question around. First, show me what you can do. So the lords crossed the Kiso River in 2 prongs, Terumasa Ikeda with 18,000 from upstream, Masanori Fukushima with 16,000 from downstream. On September 28th, the Lord of Gifu, Hidenobu Oda, chose to meet them in the open field. He lost and fell back behind his walls. The next day, the castle fell. 1 day was all it took. His grandfather, the great Nobunaga Oda, had made this mountain fortress the seat of his bid for the realm. In the grandson's hands, it was gone in a day. Hidenobu Oda took the tonsure and was sent to Mount Koya. That news changed everything. The Eastern Vanguard pushed straight on west and threw up a chain of fortified camps at Akasaka, northwest of Ogaki Castle. The West answered in kind. 30,000 men under Hidemoto Mori, Hiroye Kikawa, Eke Ankokuji, Masaya Natsuka, and Morichika Chosokabe took position along Tarui and Mount Nangu. The two armies now faced each other within a stone's throw. And the letter writer of Edo finally moved. On October 7th, Ieyasu Tokugawa marched out of Edo at the head of 33,000, drove down the Tokaido in 11 days, and on October 20th planted his standard on the rise at Akasaka. The commander-in-chief had taken the field. The shock ran through Ogaki Castle. Out of it came Sakon Shima, Mitsunari Ishida's famed strategist, with 500 men. At the Kwaisei River, he drew the Nakamura contingent into an ambush and cut down one of its commanders, Tanamo Noishiki, along with the men around him. First blood to the west, but it was a local victory and no more. The balance of the war did not shift. The real protagonist of that day stood on another mountain. Hideaki Kobayakawa, 15,000 men, 19 years old, had marched with the Western Army ever since Fushimi without ever showing where he truly stood. Now he turned out the western castellan, Morimasa Ito, and seized Mount Matsuo, the height that commands the whole basin of Sekigahara. Betrayal carried out in broad daylight. Forget the figure of legend, the timid boy lost in the fog, panicked into treason by a warning volley from Ieyasu Tokugawa's muskets. No source of the age records any of it. What happened was an open choice, made in full view of both armies and made by taking a mountain on the eve of the battle. And Ieyasu Tokugawa's web of letters already reached deep into the Mori camp. Dated that same October 20th, a blood-sealed oath signed jointly by his lieutenants Naomasa Thurao and Tadakatsu Honda, brokered by Nagamasa Kuroda, passed into the hands of Hiroi Kikuwa. The Mori would not move. In return, their domains would be left intact. By that point, the ending had all but been written. The West could see it too. Yoshitsugu Otani came racing back from the Hokuriku front and dug in on the high ground of Yamanaka, squarely facing Mount Matsuo, 600 men of his own at the core, a few thousand in all, counting the smaller lords attached to him. His dry moats and earthworks pointed at the position of an ally at Mount Matsuo. He knew. That night, leaving 7,500 men to hold Ogaki, the Western commanders marched out into the rain and the dark towards Sekigahara. Mitsunari Ishida, Yoshihiro Shimazu, Yukinaga Konishi, Hideye Yukita, a column of 30-odd thousand swinging wide around the southern foot of Mount Nangu, 10 miles of night road. This was no masterstroke to lure Ieyasu Tokugawa into a decisive battle. It was the move of men who had run out of choices. Hold down the traitor's mountain, and do not leave the friend in his trenches to die alone. The Eastern Army broke camp at Akasaka in the small hours and followed. How many men at the heart of the Western Army met that dawn believing they could win, and still they formed their line. At first light on October 21st, 1600, fog lay over the basin of Sekigahara. In the bottom of that fog, the two armies finished forming their lines almost without ever seeing each other. The West stood on the western rim around the high ground of Yamanaka, Yoshitsugu Otani's, few thousand, Hideye Ukida's 17,000, Yukinaga Konishi's 4,000 and more, Mitsunari Ishida's just under 6,000, Yoshihiro Shimazu's 1,500. All told, some 30-odd thousand actually stood in the line. Against them came the vanguard lords of the East, Masanori Fukushima, Nagamasa Kuroda, Tadaoki Hosokawa, Yoshiaki Kato, Yoshimasa Tanaka, Naomasa Ii, Tadayoshi Matsudaira, and behind them the main body of Ieyasu Tokugawa, 33,000 strong, more than 70,000 in all. On Mount Nangu, behind the Eastern Army, sat the 30,000 of the Mori. On Mount Matsuo, above its head, the 15,000 of Hideaki Kobayakawa. On the map, it was the East that stood inside a sack. But the seams of that sack had long since been cut. When the fog thinned, the battle began and became an avalanche. The 15,000 on Mount Matsuo came down the slope at a run and drove into Yoshitsugu Otani's position at the very opening of the battle. Four contingents inside the western line, 4,000 men under Yasuharu Wakisaka, and others turned their blades in the same moment. There was no interval of hesitation. A letter written 2 days later, signed jointly by two of Ieyasu Tokugawa's officers, records exactly that. Yoshitsugu Otani caught the 15,000 he had known would come in the trenches he had dug for them, and after a short and savage resistance, he was swallowed. His lieutenants Tamahiro Hiratsuka and Katsushige Toda died fighting. The man himself, his body ruined by disease, had been borne to the field on a litter by his own men. He did not let his head fall to the enemy. He took his own life, and his retainers buried the head somewhere on that field. It is said it was never found. He was not the victim of a last-minute betrayal. He was a man who knew the ending and chose to stand in it anyway. That is why he is the heart of this story. The collapse of the right wing ran down the whole line. At the center, Masanori Fukushima's 6,000 were locked with Hideo Ukita's 17,000. Stripped of its flank, the Ukita line buckled, and Yukinaga Konishi's contingent broke after it. In Mitsunari Ishida's position, Sakon Shima fell under the gunfire of Nagamasa Kuroda's men and vanished from the field. His body has never been found. The Ishida line cracked after hard resistance, and Mitsunari Ishida escaped into the Ibuki Mountains. And at Ieyasu Tokugawa's back, the 30,000 of the Mori on Mount Nangu did not move one man before the battle ended. Hiroye Kikawa, holding the forward position, sat astride the road and would not be moved. Behind him, Hidemoto Mori and Morichika Chosokabe stood looking down at the battlefield. A great army, placed exactly where a hammer should fall, stood on its mountain-like painted scenery. The battle map had never been the diagram of a trap. It was the seating chart of a negotiation already concluded. And in the middle of that route, one body of men turned the other way. Yoshihiro Shimazu, 1,500 men. He took his line of retreat through the front of the enemy, cutting past the nose of Ieyasu Tokugawa's own headquarters. His nephew Toyohisa Shimazu stood as rear guard and died at the slope of Utazaka. The house elder Moriatsu Chojuin put on his lord's battle coat and died in his place. Squad after squad of the rearguard stayed, fought, and died where they stood, grinding the pursuit down. Their fire put a bullet in Naomasa T, and Tadayoshi Matsudera was carried off bleeding. Yoshihiro Shimazu broke out by the Ise Road and reached the sea. When he came home to Satsuma, the 1,500 had become some 80 men. On this feat, every account of the battle, whatever else it disputes, agrees. Noon. A few hours after the first clash, the contest for the realm was over. At noon, Ieyasu Tokugawa took up a pen. The letter was addressed to Masamune Date, the ally still holding the north against the Wasugi. The battle was over by midday. That was the report. The message announcing the decision of the realm was as brief as a routine dispatch. Ieyasu Tokugawa rode west that same day. 2 days later, the assault fell on Sawayama, Mitsunari Ishida's own castle. The vanguard was given to Hideaki Kobayakawa's 15,000, with Yasuharu Wakisaka and the rest of the turncoats. Prove your treason again, this time on a comrade's castle. That was the casting. Holding it were Mitsunari Ishida's father, Masatsugu Ishida, and his elder brother, Masazumi Ishida, with 2,800 men. The castle fell in a day, and the Ishida family died by their own hands. Mitsunari Ishida himself ran through the Ibuki Mountains for 6 days. On October 27th, soldiers of Yoshimasa Tanaka took him. On November 6th, he was paraded through the streets of Kyoto and beheaded on the riverbank at Rokujo. Led to the execution ground with him were Eke Ankokuji and Yukinaga Konishi, who as a Christian had refused to take his own life. The 3 heads were put on display at Sanjo. Not every architect of the war was led to that riverbank. In Osaka Castle, Terumoto Mori pleaded that he had merely been deceived, and in exchange for a sealed oath hinting that his domains would be left intact, he handed over the western citadel without a fight. Ieyasu Tokugawa entered Osaka Castle, paid his respects to Hideyori Toyotomi, and showed the realm that order had been restored. Then the promise was broken. The Mori fell from 1,200,000 koku to 300,000 in Suo and Nagato. 1 quarter, the Uesugi fell from 1,200,000 to 300,000 at Yonezawa, 1 quarter. Hideo Ukita slipped away to Satsuma, and was later banished to Hachijojima, a speck of an island far out in the ocean. He would outlive every other lord who stood at Sekigahara and die on that island 55 years later. More than 80 houses on the losing side were abolished outright. The land confiscated from them came to a quarter of all Japan. On the winning side, the worth of a single letter was being converted into provinces. Masanori Fukushima received Hiroshima in Aki, 500,000 koku, Nagamasa Kuroda, Chikuzen, 520,000, Kiyomasa Kato, most of Higo, and Hideaki Kobayakawa received Okayama, 550,000 koku, built on the former lands of Hideye Ukita. 2 years later, he was dead at 21 and his house died with him. One house alone, the Shimazu, who had cut their way home through the enemy, kept every koku of their domain after 2 years of negotiation. 3 years on, in 1603, Ieyasu Tokugawa was named shogun and opened his government in Edo. The decision of the realm was not the work of one day in that basin. It was 100 days of war in the year 1600, fought across the whole of Japan from Aizu to Kyushu, and its course was set less by the sword than by hundreds of letters. Sekigahara is the name of the last morning of that long war,